We shouldn't have to record. YouTube automatically does it. So, all right. I sent Josh a text too, so I'm not sure if he's gonna come. We talked this morning. I heard he talked to you too, huh? Yeah, yeah. All right. So we left off last week with these three parables, right? So the unshrunk cloth, the new wine into the old skins, and then Jesus as the bridegroom. And we kind of decided to stop there because we're getting into this next part of Jesus's ministry, which is he's going headfirst into the controversy with the Pharisees. And so I'm actually going to break this up into two parts. So we're going to cover 23 to 28 tonight, and then we'll start on chapter 3 next week. But I want you to remember this those parables, though, because Mark puts them where they are for a specific reason, because it really does tie into what we're going into now and what Jesus' teaching is here when he's talking about this controversy over the Sabbath work. So I'm gonna read the section, and then we'll go back verse by verse like we've been going. So now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain, and the Pharisees said to him, "Look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" But he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath." So, looking at this from a high level, is there anything that stands out to you about this interaction that Jesus has right here? You're kind of getting there, and we'll talk more about where I think you're starting to go when we get to verse 27. But I think that is a good point there. Jesus is correcting some of the mistakes that the Pharisees are making. Remember, we go all the way back to the beginning of Mark 1, and he's preaching with authority, right? He's not going off of what the scribes are saying, what the Pharisees are saying, of all of these traditions of man. He comes in and he's preaching directly from the word with an absolute authority that people are able to pick up and recognize. And so now we're seeing some of that, an example of him doing that. He knows exactly what the Sabbath is for, and he is correcting it. He's correcting the people that have made the Sabbath into something that was never supposed to be. Pay attention to verse 28, and we'll get into that. That is probably, it's going to be one of the most important things that we're going to look at tonight is this statement that Jesus makes in 28. And then we're going to go into the story with it's out of 1 Samuel with David and Abiathar, but there's a lot that's kind of happening here, but this is the first real serious confrontation that we're having with Jesus and the Pharisees right now. We get a little bit of one before what we talked about last week over the fasting, but that was not in the same vein as what we are here, and we'll see that more next week of what he's doing here in these two sections. He is really starting to upset the Pharisees. He is really starting to rock the boat, and he's doing it on purpose because he needs to. He's in this next phase of his ministry. All right, so let's look at verse 23. right now. Right, so now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. Okay, so what's the problem here? We can look at, we'll go to verse 24, so we'll look at 23 and 24. So, and the Pharisees said to him, look, why do they do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? So what is the problem here? What do the Pharisees have an issue with? To their opinion, yes. So I think, sometimes you can look at this and say they're stealing. They're committing, that's in our modern understanding of this, right? In our modern society, if someone were to go up to a field that wasn't theirs and just start plucking grain or grabbing ears of corn and mom knows that story, with dad, he knew the corn stalks. I'll tell the story. So we were out at Andy and Lois's, and it was like right around Halloween. My dad had been drinking, and he had just got it stuck in his head. We need corn stalks. We need corn stalks to put up on the house. And so we're driving. They're out in Bridgeport, so we're going Bridgeport, Kirkville area, and we're going through these cornfields, and he just says, "Stop the car! Stop the car!" So he gets out and he starts ripping up corn stalks and throws them in my mom's car, and there's still like the clod on it and everything. By all intents and purposes, that's stealing. So like in the middle of the night, we did this massive corn raid because my dad needed corn stalks. So we stole a bunch of corn stalks. So that's a little extreme, but back in the first century, you were actually allowed to take things from someone's field if you were hungry. This was part of Deuteronomy 23:25, and says, if you go into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you shall not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain. Right? So you can, if you're hungry and you're in need, you can go out to someone's field, your neighbor's field, somebody that's not yours, and pull some heads of grain and eat them. Obviously, you can't go in with a sickle and just start, cutting down the whole thing and say, well, this is my harvest now. The book says that. So, but as Jenny was saying, Deuteronomy is pretty clear, right? Don't take a sickle, which, they take as, don't harvest. The Pharisees are looking at this differently and saying, well, they plucked the head. They're obviously, they're harvesting because they plucked the head. So Paul quotes Deuteronomy 25:4, which is kind of in the same vein in 1 Corinthians 9 through 10. And he says, "For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should reap in hope and the thresher thresh in the hope of sharing the crop." So Deuteronomy 25:4, it's saying, as somebody is working, as this ox is working, don't muzzle it so that it can't eat the grain that falls to the ground. Let it eat, let it. And so the same type of rule is given over in Deuteronomy 23:25. So it's a similar example, but it shows the ridiculousness of the Pharisees' interpretation, right? This law out of Deuteronomy 23:25 was given to the Hebrews, so that the hungry could be taken care of. The hungry could go. They knew that if they were down on their luck and didn't have any money to buy food, or they had a bad harvest themselves, they could go out and provide for their family. Again, not taking a sickle, but just taking what they needed to survive. And so the Hebrews actually harvested their fields in a way during this time that the corners weren't harvested. So they left out places of the field specifically meant for people to do this. So this was 100% allowed. This was part of culture. But the Pharisees are looking at this as saying, again, taking the law of the Sabbath to an absolute extreme, way beyond what it was supposed to. And this is, why we're getting into this controversy and why Jesus chooses this time. So So why he chooses this time and this method to get to have this encounter with the Pharisees. And I look at it from what do you think the significance is of Jesus deciding for them to go through the grain fields, right? We know, like, he's the one that's the leader. He's going to walk through the grain fields. He's going to take people there, right? He obviously knows what's going to happen. Why do you think Jesus had the disciples go through the grain fields? Yeah, no, he was setting. I think he was setting up the confrontation. He knew, like, and I think we kind of see that, like, the Chosen does a really good job showing that parable, right? Like, these guys are hungry, they've been working all day, and they go and they do the Sabbath healing first, right? I think that's where that is. I can't remember. It's been a little bit since we watched that episode. But they've been working. They're hungry. They go through the fields, and Peter nonchalantly, not even thinking, just starts plucking grains because it's allowed. This is something that they are allowed to do. And then it like dawns on them. Oh man, it's a Sabbath. Like, we just harvested. Like, Jesus deals with the confrontation with the Pharisees. It's like they didn't do anything. They didn't do anything at all. So, like I said, I think he did this on purpose to set up this confrontation because, we see this, he is dealing with these extra rules right now. This is what he's dealing with in his ministry in this phase. All of these extra burdens that are being placed on people that is not getting them any closer to God, but in reality is getting them farther away from God. So, we already talked about this, why the Pharisees claimed that it was unlawful. But again, to kind of highlight how ridiculous this is, so when they're plucking the grains, then they pull it off of the stalk, they put the grain in their hand and they rub it together. And so this is separating the wheat from the chaff. So they get the grain off of it, and then they can pop it into their mouth. And so the way the Pharisees are looking at it, they're saying they are reaping, winnowing, and threshing, and preparing a meal, all which are unlawful on the Sabbath. This simple act of pulling off a head of grain, putting it between their hands, rubbing it, is all, that's harvesting. They're preparing a meal. They're breaking the law. And they're referencing Leviticus 23:3. It says, 6 days shall work be done, but on the seventh day is the Sabbath of solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwelling places, right? So this they are considering this work. They are considering this harvest, and that's why they are going after the disciples. And we notice here that they went to Jesus, right? They saw the disciples, right? They saw what they're doing, and they went to Jesus as their leader. It's like, how are you're allowing this? Like, this is what you allow your disciples to do? We see this change around a little bit, too. They kind of pick and choose who they go after. Sometimes it's after Jesus specifically. Sometimes it's after the disciples. When they go after Jesus head-to-head, they always lose. He always shuts them down. They get a little bit more... they're a little bit more successful in some aspects when they're going after the disciples, but if Jesus is around, he shuts them down, even harder, because at the end of the day, Jesus knows what these guys are doing. If it was unlawful, he would stop them, he would correct them, but again, he is verifying that he is the word, his own authority. So I told you guys to remember what we talked about last week. So what do you think the significance is of this story following the parable of the cloth and the wineskins, right? So we get into this, the cloth and the wineskins is the parable immediately before this, and then we get into this story about what's lawful on the Sabbath. Why do you think Peter said it, or Peter and Mark put it together this way? And we'll dive a little bit more into this, but I think this is it's showing how Jesus is highlighting that the old way of the Pharisees are falling short to what God has always intended, right? So we get that in the old wineskins and the new wineskins, and now we're seeing a an even more powerful example of what Jesus is talking about here. But he is covering something that is a lot more spiritually significant to the Israelites than just fasting. The Sabbath is considered the holiest day, right? This is a day set aside for God. What? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and we're gonna dive deeper into that when we actually look into some parallel passages. We're gonna see, Jesus is a little bit more forceful about what he says in the Gospel of Matthew, and so yeah, he is. This is one thing that we are looking at right now in Jesus's ministry of this phase that he is in, is he is going after the Pharisees and the havoc that they have wreaked on the Hebrews right now. This is Jesus is dealing with all of these extra laws, all of these extra burdens that they have placed on people and have done nothing to help them out, and has drawn them farther away from God, right? And so, for us, as Christians, the Sabbath isn't something that it really has this big overtone for us, right? Like, we know about the Sabbath, we understand it, but most Christians really don't practice the Sabbath. For a Jew in the first century, the Sabbath was critically important to their faith. That is why they were willing to go through all of these hurdles and jump through all of these hoops to listen to what the Pharisees say, to make sure that they weren't violating the law, is because of how sacred this day was to them. And so we see this, when Jesus goes from, the parable of the old wineskins to immediately, in my opinion, looking at this, setting up this confrontation with the Pharisees, he is starting to shut down some of these things that they are saying that is destroying the real meaning of the Sabbath. Yeah, I mean, New England still has them. Yeah, yeah, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. Yeah, yep, yep. So, all right. So let's move on to 25 and 26. So this is Jesus's response. So he said, but he said to them, have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him? How he went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priest, and also gave some to those who were with him. Right? So if you guys haven't read the Old Testament and Samuel in a while, I'm going to refresh your memory on this story. So this is what Jesus is referring to. It's a story out of 1 Samuel 21, 1 through 6. And so David and his men are running for their lives from Saul, and they found themselves isolated and hungry. It's David with just a small group of his men. Saul has basically gone off the deep end again, and he's hunting him down. This is kind of the beginnings of the civil war that is really happening. So David has these men under his charge, these people that are loyal to him, that believe that he is the anointed next king of Israel. These are men that have fought with him in the wars against the Philistine, that understand that Saul has completely lost his mind at this point, and that we know that the Holy Spirit has left Saul. right? Because of his jealousness, because of the things that he had done, and his basically his hatred and jealousy towards David. So, David's got these group of men with him. They are his responsibility. So rather than starve, David ended up convincing the priest Abiathar to allow him and his men to eat the showbread, which was unlawful for them to do. So this was at it might have been at, I'm not actually sure where this was. Let me see if I have it here. Nob. Yeah, it was at Nob. So there's kind of it's not a like the big full temple, right? There wasn't a temple of Solomon yet. Obviously Solomon wasn't even born, but this was a place that the high priest would be at, and they would have the showbread that would be set out of actually I don't have the verse of where they talk about the showbread, but this was set out, and it was this was set out for God, and then they could only the priests, once they had basically consecrated themselves, were allowed to eat this bread, right? So what David did was technically against the law, right? What he did was not allowed. He even lied to the priest. From this story, he is not telling the truth. But we don't see any condemnation coming from Jesus on what he did. And I don't want to dive too much into this, because I think there's a lot that we can really dig into, right? The word doesn't say that what David did was right, but it also doesn't say what he did was wrong. I think this is a big gray area, and this is kind of what Jesus is really starting to focus on here. Now there's a key phrase here that Jesus uses. It's right here. So what David did when he was in need, right? This isn't a want that David had. This wasn't David just saying, I could use some food. Him and his men were starving. They were going to die. They had been cut off, and their only way to be able to get what they needed was to take something that wasn't theirs, that wasn't allowed to be theirs. David had to lie to be able to do this. David had to break these sacred laws to be able for his men to survive. And the Greek word here that's used is charia, and it means something that is an absolute necessity, and is generally something urgent, such as the things needed for sustenance for a journey. So when that word is used throughout the Greek, it means, again, not a want, but an absolute necessity. So, we can read this as, have you ever read what David did when he was, starving, and it had an absolute necessity for him and his men to eat. And so, Jesus, uses this, word specifically. He's focusing on this, that this was a necessity of what they did. So why did Jesus really use this story in response to the accusations that the Pharisees were making against his disciples? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yeah. That's exactly what Jesus is using this story, as that stop being so black and white. There are nuances. The world doesn't work this way, right? God never intended, to give these Sabbath laws for people to uphold to the point that they died. These were supposed to bring life. These were supposed to bring fulfillment. These were supposed to bring a meaningful existence. But the way that the Pharisees were doing it, they would literally, like, if the Pharisees, something like that happened in first century AD, right? And, somebody, the next king of Israel, David, comes around, right? And he is starving. The Pharisees would say, well, he should have just died. He should have just starved, right? Jesus is saying that's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous, the way that you guys are looking at this. And this is, something that we're going to notice with the way that Jesus shows these stories, is that he always goes to the extremes. He always uses extremes examples that are just, way overblown, to really highlight exactly how crazy these guys were. This is like the ridiculousness of these standards that they're setting. They are impossible standards. Like, if you believe in a loving God, how can you believe that God would have you starve to death rather than break a law that's been given by the Pharisees, right? And so Jesus' main point is here that the law is not meant to be followed so strictly to the point that people suffered. Ritual observances must give way to moral obligations, and that may be done in a case of necessity where it otherwise may have not been done. That's Jesus' point, right? Where he uses that word, in need, haria, the absolute necessity. What David did had to be done. It wasn't a want. He wasn't doing it to just to be a thief and to be a liar. He weighed the risks and said, I gotta feed these guys, and this is the only place that I can find food. We won't make it any farther. Yep. Yeah. 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 And it's God judges not by the outward appearances, not by outward actions, but by the heart. He knew what David was doing was out of necessity. I think it would have been a lot different if God would have understood that, would have known that David was doing this just because David wanted to be a bad guy. That he was throwing away all the laws and just said, I got to do what I got to do to make it out here. God's abandoned me. I was supposed to be the anointed one. That wasn't it. That's not the way that David was acting. David was being a leader. He was doing what was necessary. He was probably putting it on himself. Because, if you look at 1 Samuel 21:6, it's David that's going in and lying to the priest. It's David that is putting it all on him. He's not having his men go in there and say, he's like, you're not going up to them. He's like, all right, you got to go lie to this high priest. He's saying, I'll go handle this. If something bad is going to happen, it's on me. This is my decision. It's what I had to do. David was being a true leader in that regard. And as a result, he saved his men. He saved the lives of his men who, again, they'd given up everything, right? This is the beginning, really, of the civil war that's happening between David and Saul. They're giving up everything to follow this their true leader, this military leader that they had fought under, that they had believed was anointed by God and would soon be the next king of Israel. So, we can kind of look at it from that perspective of again, nowhere in the Word does it say it was right, but nowhere in the Word does it say it was wrong. And I don't think it's something that we can look at and say, well, the rules are made to be broken and we can break them all the time. This is a very specific instance of it, right? It is, and it's the same thing with the disciples going through the grain fields. This is a specific instant. They are breaking man-made laws. Jesus is saying they're not breaking any law right now. They're not breaking the Sabbath laws. This is 100% allowed. They're breaking your laws, but that's not the law of God. So I wanna talk a little bit about Abiathar here. I don't want to spend a ton of time on it, but there's something that I think some people will pick up on. It comes up in like atheist and critical circles about the contradictions and mistakes of the Bible when it talks about in the days of Abiathar the high priest. So where is it? Yeah, so this, you see how on mine, on the New King James, this is in italics. The Greek does not say this. This is something that's added on there because at the time of this story, Abiathar was not the high priest. His father, Abimelech, was. So there's a lot of debate about what this means. So, like I said, in the days of is generally added to English translations, but it's not in the Greek manuscripts. Abimelech was the high priest, not Abiathar. Abiathar was eventually became the high priest and overshadowed his father by he did a lot more than his father did. So there's a couple different theories of why the Greek has a seemingly glaring error. One plausible explanation is that's being explored is that this phrase in construction refers to a wider time frame. So where the title of high priest is used reverentially. So it's kind of like referring to a former president with the title president, even when talking about events in their past where they had yet become president. So that's one of the theories. There's a theory that it was just a mistake on the part of Mark. It was a mistake on the part of Peter, that he just misheard it wrong. He remembered it wrong, that it was copied down wrong at some point. But this isn't something that I think really needs to get caught up like in if this comes up in circles of people saying, oh, this is just another example of the contradiction of the Bible, or being used that's being critical. There's multiple plausible answers from biblical Greek and Jewish scholars on this passage, but there's no definite answer yet. But on top of it, the parallel passages don't have these issues. So this just could be a mistake from the part of the scribes that copied it. Matt 12:12 and Luke 4 just don't even mention this. This could have just been like a mistake from Peter. It could have been a misunderstanding of what he was of what Jesus had. Peter was very old when he was giving all of this to Mark, right? So there's a bunch of plausible answers, but this isn't something that pops up again and again and again. This is right now we don't have a definite answer. There's a lot of people that are looking into what this actually means, but like I said, the parallel passages don't have this issue at all. So this isn't something that I think we necessarily need to get caught up in. Like I said, there's plausible answers to why it could be this way. Okay. So going on to 27, Mom, you already kind of picked up on this, and so and he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath." So, again, we already kind of cover this, but what did Jesus mean that the Sabbath was created for man? Yeah, it was made to help us, not hurt us. So what's Jesus's bigger point in all of this? Like, what's like, you look at this story as a whole. What is the bigger point that he's trying to make? Yep. Yeah. It. Somebody want to say something? Okay. Um. So, yeah, the strict adherence to the law to the point of suffering and death was never the intention of God. God designed the Sabbath to be an advantage, not a disadvantage to us. Overall, God gave us the Sabbath in some regards to rest our physical bodies, but as Jesus showed in Mark 2:5, God is always more concerned with our souls than our bodies. The Sabbath was meant as a day to restore and rest our souls and be in communion with God rather than following on strict physical adherences to laws. Right? So this is why Jesus is dealing with this confrontation. This is why Jesus is setting up this moment and argument with the Pharisees, is because this was meant to be a help to people, not a hindrance. But the Pharisees had thrown on so many extra rules that it was burdening people. It was instead of looking at the Sabbath as a day that they could look forward to, which is what God had always intended, I guarantee they dreaded it. Friday night starts rolling around, and they're like, I got to do all of this work right now because if one of these Pharisees catches me, going around and opening up a cupboard door, I'm in real trouble. And this strict interpretation of the law is still practiced today in Israel. If you go to Israel on the Sabbath, they aren't allowed, the Orthodox aren't allowed to basically turn on switches or make an electrical connection. So all of the buttons in the elevators in hotels are disabled during the Sabbath. They have a special program on there that allows them it goes in and stops on every single floor. This is how extreme that they're looking at this, right? Like, all of these additional laws and burdens keep getting on there. The Sabbath is not a day of rest. The Sabbath is when it's treated in that way, it is exhausting. Thinking about all of these things that you have to do and to make sure that you're upholding this law, it is absolutely exhausting, and it is never what God had intended. And that's Jesus's big point. So Jesus further expresses the issues of the ultra strict interpretation of the law in Luke 11:46, and he said, "Woe to the you lawyers also, for you load people with burdens hard to bear, and you yourselves do not touch the burdens with one of your fingers." And then Matt 23:4, "They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger." So again, instead of the Sabbath being a day of rest of humanity, the Pharisees turned the Sabbath into a burden upon itself. The Sabbath became a burden rather than to rest. What I found pretty interesting when I was looking into this is that there is a late second century rabbi that wrote a commentary on Exodus, and he actually confirms what Jesus is saying. This is it's Exodus 31:13, when the Sabbath is given over. It says, "You are to speak to the people of Israel and say, above all you shall keep my Sabbath, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I, the Lord, sanctify you." And so this Rabbi Ishmael, in his Mechalita de Rabbi Ishmael commentary on 31:13, says, "And you shall keep the Sabbath, for it is holy to you. Sabbath is given to you, and you are not given to the Sabbath." Sabbath is supposed to be a gift. It is supposed to be a gift for God's people. And so, this was a radical rabbi. His works are not seen today in Orthodox Judaism. But there were people, rabbis after Jesus, that were looking into this, that understood what Jesus was saying. This is a gift. So there's I want to go into the parallel passages here, because I think they're actually give a decent amount of context. It says Matthew's telling of his confrontation gives us some additional points in Matthew 12:25. And it says, "Or have you not read in the law how the Sabbath, the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless?" So, this is out of ESV, so it's a little bit, harder to understand. But what Jesus is saying is that the priests that work on the Sabbath are they're an exception and they're guiltless. So he's not quoting anything specific out of Old Testament law, but this is an understanding that people have, right? Like the priests obviously have to work on the Sabbath, right? They obviously have to work. This is there's things that they have to do. They have to carry burdens, because Numbers, it's kind of like a rough reference to Numbers 28:9. It says, "On the Sabbath day, 2 male lambs a year old without blemish, and 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour for a grain offering mixed with oil and its drink offering." So these are specific offerings that the priest has to do on certain Sabbath days. This is carrying a burden, right? You have to pick up this lamb, move it over, sacrifice it, do all of these things that could be considered work. The way that the Pharisees were looking at this would have been work, but nobody's going to the priest and saying, "You're breaking the Sabbath law. What are you doing?" It's understood that this is an exception, and they are seen guiltless. And so Jesus is talking about that in 12:5. And so in 12:6 in Matthew, Jesus adds, I tell you, something greater than the temple is here." And then he closes, we can, talk about that a little bit, but he is showing, all right, you've got these priests, right, that are seen guiltless in the temple for all that they're doing. And he said, but there's something that is greater than the temple is here now, right? He's obviously referring to himself as, the kingdom is breaking through. And, Jesus, closes out, basically with verse 28 and every single one of these tellings, and Matthew gives a little bit more context. But one of my favorite things that Jesus says in this is in this telling in Matthew, closes out with a strong pointed quote from Hosea 6:6. He says, "For let me actually go to it. Sorry." So he says, I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the guiltless. And I think that's, it's an amazing quote that we have from Jesus right there, right? So he's quoting Hosea 6:6, "For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings," right? And so, I think this is one of the most amazing quotes that we get out of these Old Testament prophets, especially Hosea, right? God is saying, "I want your love, not your sacrifice. I want you to know me rather than just to know about me," right? And Jesus is saying, the same thing. If you knew what this meant, if you knew what Hosea was saying, you would have not condemned the guiltless. He says, "These people, my disciples, did nothing wrong. They are following me. They are following God. It is you that's added all these additional burdens on them. You are condemning them when they're guiltless." It's kind of, this is like stereotypical Jesus of how he's so pointed and in very few words, and he's using the scripture, right, to go after these false beliefs, to go after these misconceptions. Like I said, we're in this phase right now with Jesus where the Pharisees are not liking him. They're not liking anything that he's saying. He is really starting to upset them, and you can see this. This is a little tame and Mark, but reading that whole exchange out of Matthew, the same exchange, and having that additional context that Matthew gives, it's easy to see why the Pharisees are getting so upset at him. So again, if you only knew what this meant, you would never condemn the guiltless. And I think, it's an amazing thing that Jesus is doing there. And he's shutting down these people that have just been driving people away from God, that have, bastardized what God has given people as a gift, that they have destroyed this relationship that God wanted with people. Because, don't think I have it here. One second. I wanna read something. It's John 6:26. John 5:39. So this is Jesus with one of his other confrontations that he's having with the Pharisees. He says, "You search scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me. Yet you refuse to come to me that you may have life." I want to read that again. You search the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and it is they that bear witness about me. Yet you refuse to come to me that you may have life. And so, what Jesus is saying here, right, is like they were diving into the word and looking at how to do to follow this to the exact T. Interpret all these little things that God wanted them to do. And then when God shows up, they completely miss him. Completely miss them. Right? That's, Jesus is really, you could tell that like he's frustrated, right? It's like all the scriptures point to me, right? Like when we read the Old Testament, if we read it from this perspective that everything in the Old Testament is pointing to Jesus. Everything is pointing to Jesus. That's what Jesus is saying in John 5:39. They think that if they just follow this to the exact T, that they get every little thing right, that they live a perfect life, which is impossible for anyone but Jesus to do, that they'll have eternal life, that they'll get their resurrection. And Jesus is saying, that's not it. The scriptures bear witness to me. You can't work your way into eternal life. You have to believe in me. And they got so deep into it that they missed the face of God when he was looking right at them. And that's exactly what was happening here with the Sabbath. The Sabbath, again, this was meant to be a gift. This was meant to be a time to get closer to God. How much were they thinking about God when they're worried about if they're breaking the laws constantly? Is this a burden? Am I allowed to pick up my child? Is that a burden? Is God going to get angry at me? That they're not thinking about God at all. It's not getting them any closer to God, and they're getting farther and farther away the more laws that got put onto them. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's, why Jesus is quoting Hosea, right? It's like God was telling the prophet, I don't care about your sacrifices. I don't care about your rituals. I want you to know me. You're not knowing me. You're not experiencing me. You're not taking anything that I've given you and looking for me in it. All of these rules, all of these rituals, all of these things that they're doing, they thought it was a path for them to get closer to God, but all it did every single time was pull them farther away. And this wasn't just Jesus saying this. We have this throughout the Old Testament with prophets coming in and saying God doesn't even see these sacrifices because they're done in vain. These aren't sweet smelling aromas to his nose. They're nothing. He hates them because they're not done with love. They're done out of this sense of like obedience, but not an obedience out of love. Obedience as this. Say that again. Yeah. 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 And I mean, you do see that, right? Like you see people like Joseph of Arithmia. Um, yeah, you see Nicodemus, right? Yeah, yep, yeah. And he tried. He tried. Um, these are the people that should have known, right? These are the ones that should have seen that God was with them, and they totally missed it, completely missed it, and that's why Jesus came when he did. He had to get everything back on track. Oh, did my camera die? No, I'm frozen. Yeah. Okay. I was worried about that. All right. I can change the battery, or I can just go to. I'll just go to that. Okay. We're almost done, anyways. Okay. Um. Okay. So last verse 28. Like I said, this is the probably the most important um uh verse out of this section. And then Jesus says, therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. Why is Jesus saying the Son of Man was Lord of the Sabbath? Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Um is that Shania? um so God is the ultimate judge, and the Sabbath comes from him, not from man. It was made for man, but it was made by God. Um, this kind of harkens back to Mark 2:10, where but you may know the Son of Man has the authority to forgive sins, right? He says the paralytic, take up your mat and walk. This is another one of Jesus' self claims to divinity. He is saying, I have the authority, right? I am God, because I can say what is lawful on the Sabbath and what isn't. So there's some humanist leaning scholars that take the Son of Man to mean mankind. Um, Jesus never uses the term like that. It's always used as a title for himself, and it's always in the vein of Daniel's vision of the Messiah. So, this is kind of like a this liberal reinterpretation of what Son of Man means. It's like, oh, Jesus is saying man is the ultimate authority on what's good for him on the Sabbath. That's not what he's saying. He's never used Son of Man to refer to mankind. It's always been a title that he's given himself. There's a ton of flaws with that logic. The Sabbath is directly linked to creation, and it was a commandment given to man by God for our own good, out of his guidance for us to live a fulfilling life. How would it ever make sense that any man or rabbi would have the authority over the Sabbath taken away from God himself, right? That's a big hole in that logic that Jesus is saying, man's got the authority to, man can say what's good for him and what's good, what he can do and what he can't do on the Sabbath. That's not what he's saying at all. Rather, this is a direct claim by Jesus of his divinity and authority. God gave man the Sabbath, and from the beginning has been Lord over it. Jesus is simply confirming this fact, not giving the Sabbath back to humanity. In fact, this authority is exactly what the rabbis of Jesus' time were trying to take for themselves, and as a result, like we talked about earlier, they managed to turn the Sabbath from a day of rest given to us by God for spiritual and physical renewal into a day of burden. So this is what happens when man tries to take authority away from God, is we get this. We get not having to not being able to press a button on an elevator on Saturday night. You get people being told that you're gonna it's better for you to die than to quote unquote harvest on the Sabbath when you're hungry. Yeah, it was set up. It was set up for us to rest, to take to get all of our work done, in those 6 days, right? Get all of them done, and then spend Sunday refreshing our body and refreshing our mind, or Saturday refreshing our body, refreshing our mind. That is why it was given. This was unique, right? It was unique. God rested on the seventh day. Right? He says, remember this. I was talking to my mom about this. In Deuteronomy, there's two reasons for the Sabbath. It's originally linked to creation out of Exodus, but it's also linked to a reminder to the Hebrews of God's ability to get them through things, the God's ability to overcome. It is a time. It is meant to be a time of reflection back on God. That is what when Deuteronomy 5 talks about it, is supposed to be this reflection of the power of God and God's love that he has for us. Again, as we're talked about, how can you be reflecting on the love that God has and worshiping God and the power that God has when you're so caught up in the weeds of determining whether or not you're actually breaking a law? That's all you're focused on all day. And it's not just that day. You have to prepare all week for the Sabbath. Forgot to make meals for yourself? Well, I guess you're not eating. Sorry. Right? So, what's the point of this saying? Like, why does Jesus throw this in there like that? Like I said, this is in every single one of the tellings, right? So why does he just kind of throw it in the way that he does? He ends this conversation saying that, therefore the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. And it's, this is kind of a mic drop moment. We don't get any commentary else after that. He just says that, and then just, kind of everybody moves on. I can't imagine everybody just moved on. I imagine there's a lot of, pearl clutching that's happening at this point when Jesus says this. So, go ahead. Yep. Yep. Yeah, He's got nothing else to say, right? Like you accept it or you don't, right? You accept it or you don't. He's not going to sit there and hold your hand on it and let you go off on your tangents. Just like I said what I said. Deal with it. You know, I have this commentary that I pulled that I think offers really good insight into this, and it's a Gospel According to Mark, the Pillar New Testament commentary. It says, Mark 2:27 through 28 preserve an important clue concerning the relationship of Jesus and the Torah, gospel and law, which have long been a point of controversy in Christianity. The extremes of both legalism and antinomianism, which is the rejection of law, are avoided. The law is not here regarded as an autonomous revelation, which in legalism tends to replace the person of God. That's kind of what we've been talking about, right? That this legalism replaces the person of God. When we're so caught up on following the absolute minute detail of the law, interpreting it a billion different ways, adding our own commentary and understanding on top of it, we've made an idol. We've crafted an idol out of words. We have replaced God completely in this tract of legalism. So, nor is Jesus a free agent who abrogates, repeals the Sabbath or the moral order or the revealed will of God, as in antinomianism. Rather, the sayings of Mark 2:27 through 28 teach that the righteous purpose of God as manifested in the Torah can be recovered and fulfilled only in relation to Jesus, who is Lord. Remember, he said, I came to fulfill the law, not to overturn it, not to repeal it. I came to fulfill it. And that's what we're seeing here. That's what that statement is saying. I am fulfilling the law. I am Lord of the Sabbath. It is my authority. I say what is right and what is wrong. Not you. You don't have that authority. That authority belongs to God and will always stay with God. So that's where I wanted to stop today. Because if we dive into 3, we go into another controversy here, and that's going to take another hour and a half to get through. So. Amen.